The southern plains in early summer looked the same in every direction. Grass and sky, broken only by a cottonwood draw following some dry creek bed or a limestone shelf cutting hard lines through the flat ground. The distances are impossible to judge. A man can ride for days without a landmark he can name. For people who did not know this country, it was a place designed to swallow armies whole. For the Numunuu, the ones history would call Comanche, it was beginning to feel like home. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Sometime in the first years of the 1700s, a group of Numunuu warriors pushed south and east from camps near the mountains. They were not the first of their people to make this journey. The bands had been spreading across the high plains for perhaps a decade, following buffalo, establishing range, pressing against the Apache groups who had held this country for a generation. But on this particular journey, somewhere south of the Arkansas River, the scouts found something they had not expected. Men they did not recognize. Men dressed differently than any Apache or Pueblo person they had encountered. Men with horses of a quality that surpassed even the best animals the bands had been acquiring through raid and trade. And in their hands, or hanging at their sides, something that required understanding before any decision could be made. A weapon that carried fire and sound and killed from a distance no bow could reach. What those warriors said to each other in that moment is not recorded anywhere. The first documented Spanish mention of the Comanche appears in Juan de Ulibarri's 1706 expedition diary, and by the time Ulibarri wrote his account, the Numunuu were already a known force on the southern plains. They were already shaping the politics of the country east of New Mexico, already driving Apache bands south toward the Spanish settlements those bands had been raiding for a generation. By the time Ulibarri wrote, the Numunuu were not discovering the Spanish. They had been studying them. This is the story of that study, of what two worlds looked like when they first came into real contact, of what the record actually shows about how the Comanche understood what they were looking at, and of why the Spanish, who had conquered the great civilizations of Mexico and Peru, discovered that the Numunuu were a problem they could not solve by the same methods. To understand the encounter, you have to understand what the Comanche were before they appeared in Spanish documents. The Numunuu had not always lived on the southern plains. Their origins lay further north and west, in the mountain foothills and high basin country of what is now Wyoming and southern Colorado, in the same broad cultural world as the eastern Shoshone. They were a Shoshonean people, connected by language and ancestry to groups spread across the Great Basin and the Mountain West. They hunted bison on foot, using dogs to haul loads on travois frames. They gathered plant foods across seasonal ranges. They moved with the rhythms of a country that punished error and rewarded patience. They were expert at what they did. The high basin country they moved through was not the kind of landscape that rewarded carelessness. The winters were hard, the game unpredictable, and the margin for error thin enough that the skills required to survive it were genuinely sophisticated. They tracked across stone. They read weather in ways that people living in settlements rarely needed to. They knew which plants held water, which routes would carry a family through a week when the hunt had failed, which passes through the mountains remained open late in the season. This knowledge was precise and accumulated across generations, passed through story and practice and observation in the way knowledge moves when it cannot be written down. But they were not, before the horse, a people that a Spanish frontier commander would have considered a serious military problem. That was about to change in ways that no one, Spanish or Numunuu, fully anticipated. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is remembered for what it meant to the Spanish. Their expulsion from New Mexico, over 400 colonists and priests dead, 2 decades of missionary work undone in a single summer. But the revolt had a consequence that most history books treat as a footnote. When the Spanish fled south toward El Paso del Norte, they left behind their horse herds. Thousands of animals scattered across the territory of New Mexico. Pueblo communities that had tended those horses for Spanish masters now controlled them. And horses moved through trade networks faster than any colonial authority could track or contain. The Eastern Shoshone and their Numunuu relatives began acquiring horses through those networks within a generation. What happened next remains one of the more extraordinary transformations in North American history. A pedestrian hunting people adapted to mounted life with a speed and completeness that surprised every observer who recorded it. Within one generation, perhaps two, the Numunuu were among the finest riders on the continent. This is not a romantic claim. It is the consistent observation of Spanish military officers who spent years trying to fight them and who had no interest in flattering the enemy. The Numunuu bred horses selectively, culling animals that did not meet their standards and developing strains suited to the punishing conditions of the plains. They developed riding techniques specific to mounted combat and mounted hunting. A warrior could guide a horse with his knees while shooting a bow at a full gallop. He could hang off the far side of a running animal using a loop of braided rawhide around his neck and the horse's body, keeping that mass of muscle and bone between himself and incoming fire while shooting under the animal's neck at a target 50 yards away. Spanish soldiers, who prided themselves on a cavalry tradition stretching back centuries, watched this and understood what they were seeing. Their official reports sometimes minimized it. Their behavior in the field did not. The Numunuu also understood the logistics of horses in a way that distinguished them from many other plains peoples. They knew what grasses sustained animals through a hard plains winter and which dried-out ranges would starve them. They knew when to walk a horse and when to run it, how to preserve the condition of an animal across a raid covering 300 miles, how to manage a herd of captured animals through a long withdrawal back to the bands. This knowledge, accumulated fast and passed down faster, gave them a strategic mobility that Spanish columns moving on Spanish road networks could rarely match in open country. They moved onto the southern plains carrying all of this and began transforming the region's politics immediately. The scale of that transformation still surprises people who encounter it in detail for the first time. The Comanche did not simply adopt the horse as a tool. They reorganized their entire society around it. Band size increased because mounted hunting made larger groups viable. The range of movement expanded dramatically. Trade networks that had operated across dozens of miles now operated across hundreds. Young men who might have spent a lifetime in a single mountain watershed now rode through countries spanning what would later become 4 or 5 American states. The horse changed what marriage meant, what raiding meant, what wealth meant, and what it meant to be a man with standing among the Numunuu. Within 2 generations, the Comanche were not a pedestrian people who had acquired horses. They were a horse people in the deepest sense, a culture shaped at every level by the animal that had arrived among them with the speed and consequence of a revolution. The Spanish world they were entering had been established for over 100 years and was, in several respects, showing its age. The colonial government in Santa Fe maintained a small military garrison and a network of Franciscan missions among the Pueblo communities. The economy of the province depended heavily on Pueblo labor and on trade goods moving north from Mexico City along the long, exposed Camino Real. Spanish settlers were thin on the ground and spread across a large territory. The military capacity of the northern frontier was real but bounded. Punitive expeditions could be organized against a fixed target. Sustained campaigns against a mobile enemy on the high plains were another matter entirely. The Spanish had 2 centuries of experience with indigenous peoples across the Americas. They had developed a range of methods for absorbing or defeating cultures encountered in their expansion: military force, mission conversion, economic dependency, alliance building against mutual enemies. These methods had worked against the Aztec, the Inca, the Maya, and dozens of smaller polities. They had worked, imperfectly, against the sedentary Pueblo communities of New Mexico. They had worked with variable success against Apache bands in the northern country. The Comanche presented a problem the Spanish system had no template for. Not because they were uniquely fierce, though Spanish soldiers would have disputed the idea that this mattered less than they thought, but because they were organized in ways the colonial machinery could neither negotiate with on familiar terms nor defeat by familiar methods. They had no permanent settlements to destroy. They had no crops to burn and no granaries to seize. They had no chiefs in the Spanish sense, leaders whose submission would compel the submission of everyone beneath them. Comanche authority was distributed and situational. A man led a war party because he had earned the right to be followed, and he retained that right only as long as his decisions proved sound. Lose one leader and another rose in his place, because the role was not attached to a position or inherited through a lineage. It was attached to demonstrated ability. The Spanish were practiced at beheading an empire. They had no framework for fighting something that had no single head. There was another dimension to the problem that the Spanish found difficult to articulate clearly in their official reports, though it surfaces in their private correspondence. The Comanche were, in the judgment of the frontier officers who actually had to deal with them, simply better in open country than the Spanish military force available in the north. A Spanish column moving out of Santa Fe or San Antonio carried with it the weight of its supply lines, its institutional structure, its need to move and camp and operate in ways that European military tradition prescribed. A Comanche war party had none of those constraints. They chose when to engage and when to disappear. They understood the terrain in ways no Spanish officer posted to the frontier for a few years could match. In the country north and east of the Spanish settlements, they were on ground they knew. The Spanish were perpetual strangers. The first sustained pressure on Spanish New Mexico did not come from the Comanche directly. It came through the Apache bands that had lived east and north of the Spanish settlements began moving toward those settlements in growing numbers through the first decade of the 1700s. Some asked for Spanish protection. Some simply crowded into territories already under pressure from other directions. The governors of New Mexico received report after report. A powerful people from the north was pressing the Apache hard. They were called, variously, Yutas, Comanches, or Equestrians in early documents, depending on which Apache band was reporting and which Spanish official was doing the recording. The names were inconsistent because the Spanish were still learning who they were dealing with. The Apache who were fleeing had no such confusion. Juan de Ulibarri's 1706 expedition went northeast from Santa Fe with a specific purpose, recovering Picurus Pueblo people who had fled east during a period of unrest and were living with Plains peoples near the Arkansas River. Ulibarri's diary is the earliest clear Spanish document placing the Comanche on the southern plains in the company of a Spanish expedition. His account is brief. He identifies bands he calls Yutas Comanches and describes them as numerous and as enemies of the Jicarilla Apache, who were at that time useful allies of the Spanish frontier. He does not record in any detail what was said between his expedition and the Comanche bands he encountered. What survives in his account is the impression these were not a minor inconvenience. They were something the Spanish would need to take seriously. What Ulibarri's diary does not record, because he was not in a position to know it, was the degree to which the Comanche already understood the Spanish frontier. The Numunuu had been in contact with Pueblo peoples and Apache groups who had extensive experience with the Spanish system for years before Ulibarri rode northeast. They knew about the settlements at Santa Fe and Taos and the missions along the Rio Grande. They had a working picture of what the Spanish frontier looked like, where it was strong and where it was thin, long before a Spanish official sat down to describe them in an official document. The 1706 expedition was not a first contact in any real sense. It was the first time a Spanish official had been close enough to write a report about people who had been watching the Spanish for years. It would be another 13 years before a more detailed account of Comanche-Spanish contact was written down. In 1719, Governor Antonio de Valverde y Cosio organized a substantial expedition northeast from Santa Fe. He had two stated purposes: to investigate reports of French traders moving onto the high plains from the Missouri country, and to assess the Comanche situation directly. The French angle was a real concern. France and Spain were rivals across North America, and French weapons reaching Comanche or other plains peoples represented a threat the colonial government in Mexico City took seriously. Valverde reached the headwaters of the Arkansas River in the fall of that year and made contact with a large Comanche encampment. The council that followed lasted several days. This is the closest thing to a documented record of early formal Comanche-Spanish diplomacy that survives. Valverde's journal, translated and published in Alfred Barnaby Thomas's 1935 collection of Spanish exploration records, describes Comanche leaders who arrived at the council on their own terms. They came through interpreters, Jicarilla Apache men who had been brought along as translators, and that chain of language deserves a moment of consideration. Every word attributed to the Comanche in Valverde's journal passed through at least two languages before a Spanish official wrote it down for an audience in Mexico City. What the Comanche actually said and what Valverde recorded as having been said may not be identical, and almost certainly are not complete. Official Spanish colonial reports were written to reassure superiors that situations were manageable. They were not transcripts. With that caveat in place, what the journal preserves is significant. The Comanche leaders told Valverde they were willing to trade. They identified their primary enemies as nations to the northeast, Pawnee and others who had been supplied with French firearms and who were pressing Comanche ranges from that direction. They expressed knowledge of Spanish settlements and Spanish goods that indicated they had been watching the frontier for some time before this formal meeting. And they made no gesture of submission, offered no recognition of Spanish authority over their territory, and required nothing that resembled an acknowledgement that the Spanish had any particular standing to be there. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Valverde reported this encounter in the language of a colonial governor managing a border problem. He did not describe himself as having negotiated with an equal, but the terms he recorded and the 80 years of Comanche-Spanish relations that followed suggest the leaders in that camp had a clearer read on the situation than the man writing the report. It is worth holding that 1719 counsel against what came after. Within 20 years, Comanche bands would be raiding deep into Texas. Within 40 years, they would be determining the terms on which Spanish settlements in the north could function. The leaders who sat across from Valverde in 1719 were not supplicants seeking Spanish favor. They were gathering information, establishing a channel, and presenting the Spanish with a version of their intentions designed to keep that channel open while the Comanche continued to expand their range and press their advantages elsewhere. This kind of simultaneous engagement across multiple modes of relationship, trade here, raiding there, diplomacy somewhere else, was characteristic of how the Comanche managed powerful neighbors throughout the 18th century. It was not dishonesty in any simple sense. It was the pragmatic complexity of a sovereign people dealing with a colonial power on the only terms that served their long-term interests. The popular image of the early Comanche-Spanish encounter has a particular shape. The cavalry charge, the dramatic clash on open ground, the confrontation between the old world and the new. That image has served novelists and filmmakers well for 150 years. The historical record does not primarily support it, at least not for this early period. The Comanche of the first decades of the 1700s were not in a state of open, total war with the Spanish. They were in a state of managed relationship, one that included trade, pressure, violence, and negotiation in shifting proportions depending on what the Comanche needed at any given moment. The ability to move between these modes, to present as a trading partner on one occasion and a raiding force on another, was not hypocrisy or inconsistency. It was strategy, and it was a strategy the Spanish administrative system, built around formal declarations and fixed alliances and the assumption that relationships were stable once established, never fully worked out how to counter. Thomas Cavanaugh, in his detailed study of Comanche political organization, Comanche political history, argues that this flexibility reflected a political culture that operated on different principles than the colonial administration it was dealing with. Comanche leaders built their authority through successful action, not through titles inherited or positions granted by a superior power. A leader who proposed an alliance that proved disadvantageous would lose followers to other leaders. A leader whose raids produced horses, captives, and goods would draw followers toward his band. The system was competitive in a specific way that produced leadership capable of genuine strategic thinking, leadership that had to earn its position with every significant decision. The oral tradition of the Numunuu, collected by ethnographers working in the 19th and early 20th centuries, adds a dimension to this picture that Spanish colonial documents cannot supply. Ernest Wallace and E. Adamson Hobel, in their 1952 work, The Comanches, Lords of the South Plains, recorded accounts from Comanche elders that had passed through multiple generations before being written down. These accounts cannot be treated as verbatim reports of early encounters. The distance in time is too great and the circumstances of collection too complex for that. But they are not therefore worthless. In some respects, they are more candid than the Spanish records, because they are not written to reassure a superior authority that everything is under control. What the oral tradition preserves about the early contact period is, broadly, a story of recognition and assessment. The Numunuu encountered the Spanish, recognized them as powerful in specific ways, and began working out how that power could be used, avoided, or overcome. Stories collected in the 19th century describe the Spanish and the goods and animals associated with them. In terms of practical utility, the horse was the most important thing the Spanish world had made available, and the Comanche had already secured that through their own means. Firearms were important and worth acquiring. Metal tools and cloth moved well through Comanche trade networks. The spiritual authority claimed by the priests, the god depicted suffering on crossed wood and carried on long journeys across the desert by black-robed men on foot, appears in later accounts as curious, as something requiring interpretation, but not as definitively superior to Comanche's spiritual practice. The accounts also preserve something that the Spanish records rarely show from the other direction: a sense of the Spanish as a people who were predictable. The Numunuu had a term for reading an adversary's patterns, for understanding how they would move under pressure and what they could be expected to do when they felt threatened. It is not a single translatable word so much as a practice, a habit of strategic attention that good leaders cultivated deliberately. What the oral accounts suggest is that the Comanche applied this practice to the Spanish early and found the Spanish, for all their power, relatively legible. They had patterns. They had fears. They had a system that could be worked if you understood how it operated. This was, in the estimation of the people who had to live alongside them, the most important thing to know. The Numunuu had their own spiritual framework, one that located power in the natural world and in the relationships between human beings and the beings that shared the land with them. Medicine, in the Comanche sense, was practical and individual, a set of relationships and obligations negotiated by each person with the forces that shaped their life. It was not a system easily impressed by the institutional claims of the Catholic Church, which presented itself as the single conduit of a single God, single truth. The Comanche response to this claim, as best the fragmentary record can show, was a form of polite acknowledgement that meant something less than acceptance. They could adopt Christian forms when it served them in a trading relationship. They did not thereby abandon what they carried from before. This matters. Part of what had made Spanish conquest work in other contexts was the psychological dimension of the encounter, the sense, sometimes encouraged by the Spanish and sometimes arising from genuine incomprehension, that the newcomers possessed supernatural authority. There are documented cases from Mesoamerica where indigenous peoples initially interpreted Spanish soldiers or their weapons as evidence of divine power. The Comanche oral tradition does not preserve this. The accounts that survive treat the Spanish as human and comprehensible. Powerful, certainly. Dangerous, certainly. Something to be studied and responded to. The warriors who came back from those early observations were not reporting a vision. They were reporting military intelligence. The Comanche drew on several sources to build their understanding of what the Spanish were and how they operated. They raided Spanish-allied Apache camps, and in doing so acquired horses, weapons, and captives who had lived inside the Spanish frontier system and knew its workings. They traded at Spanish frontier posts, and in doing so acquired firearms, metal goods, and cloth while observing the Spanish market directly, learning what the Spanish valued, what they feared, and where their settlements were vulnerable. They maintained contact with Pueblo communities that existed in a complicated relationship with Spanish authority, and through those connections accessed additional information about the colonial system, its supply lines, its military capacity, and its internal tensions. What the Comanche were building, in the language a modern strategist might use, was intelligence. Systematic, patient, gathered through multiple channels over years and decades. The Spanish garrison at Santa Fe knew roughly how many Comanche there were in a given season. The Comanche knew the size of that garrison, the condition of its horses, the supply situation, and how long it would take for reinforcements to arrive from the south. The information asymmetry favored the Numunuu, and they used it accordingly. They also pressed steadily south and west, taking range from Apache bands, and establishing Comanche presence in territory the Spanish had assumed was firmly within the Apache sphere of influence. This displacement was not a single event or a single campaign. It unfolded across decades, band by band and range by range, as Comanche groups moved south from the Arkansas and the Canadian rivers toward the Red River country and the high plains of what is now the Texas Panhandle. The Lipan Apache, who had held much of this territory, found themselves caught between Comanche pressure from the north and east and the Spanish settlements to the south and west. Their options narrowed steadily. Some bands moved toward the Spanish frontier, accepting a dependent relationship with colonial settlements in exchange for some measure of protection. Others retreated south into the brush country beyond the reach of both powers. None of them recovered the ranges they had held before the Comanche arrived. The Apache displacement mattered to the Spanish for reasons beyond the loss of useful allies. The Apache, for all the trouble they had caused Spanish settlements over the years, had also functioned as a kind of buffer, a presence in the country between New Mexico and Texas that complicated any other people's access to the Spanish frontier. When the Apache were pushed south, that buffer disappeared. The Comanche were now the neighbors of the Spanish settlements in a direct and immediate way. There was no longer an intermediate country to cross. The distance between a Comanche camp on the Llano Estacado and a Spanish rancho north of San Antonio was a matter of days on horseback. The Llano Estacado, the great flat tableland of the Texas Panhandle, became Comanche country in the second quarter of the 18th century. The Spanish called the territory the Comancheria, a word that acknowledged the reality even as Spanish official reports continued to discuss the theoretical possibility of eventually bringing the Comanche under colonial authority. That possibility receded steadily throughout the century. By the 1740s and 1750s, Comanche raiding parties were striking deep into Texas, hitting settlements south of San Antonio that were supposed to be beyond the reach of the High Plains bands. By the 1760s, Spanish Texas was in a condition that the colonial government acknowledged, in its internal correspondence, as something close to crisis. Missions were being abandoned. Settlers were retreating. The northern frontier of New Spain was contracting rather than expanding, and the mechanism of that contraction was not a single military defeat, but a sustained, grinding pressure that the Spanish military could not relieve. Pekka Hämäläinen's work on Comanche history, The Comanche Empire, published in 2008, demonstrates through careful examination of Spanish colonial archives that by the second half of the 18th century the Comanche had effectively reversed the normal terms of the colonial relationship. Instead of the Spanish system incorporating the Comanche into its economy on Spanish terms, the Comanche had made the Spanish frontier economically dependent on Comanche trade. Spanish settlements in Texas and New Mexico needed Comanche horses. They needed the buffalo hides and dried meat that moved through Comanche trade networks. The colonial economy of the northern frontier could not function without goods that moved through Comanche-controlled territory. The arrangement had inverted in ways that Spanish officials described obliquely in their reports because the direct description would have been embarrassing. Governor Juan Bautista de Anza of New Mexico understood this clearly by the early 1780s. Anza was not a man given to self-deception about frontier realities. He had spent years on the northern frontier, led successful military campaigns, and knew the Comanche as well as any Spanish official of his era. He had even led an expedition in 1779 that killed the prominent Comanche leader Cuerno Verde in the field, a victory that demonstrated the Spanish could strike hard when conditions favored them. What the expedition also demonstrated was the limit of that success. Killing a Comanche leader did not end Comanche power on the southern plains. Other leaders took his place. The raiding continued. The fundamental reality of the Comancheria did not change. In 1786, Anza traveled to meet with the Comanche leader Equiricapa at a location the Comanche had chosen, and he negotiated a peace that acknowledged Comanche authority on the southern plains with a directness unusual in colonial documents of the period. The Peace of 1786 is sometimes described in older histories as a Spanish diplomatic triumph, the Crown finally managing the Comanche problem through negotiation where military force had failed. The terms do not support this reading. The Spanish agreed to trade arrangements that served Comanche interests. They agreed to joint operations against groups that the Comanche identified as enemies, specifically Lipan Apache bands that had been raiding from the south. They provided gifts and goods as part of the agreement in quantities that reflected the Comanche's bargaining position, not the Spanish crown's generosity. Equiricapa, for his part, accepted terms that gave his people continued access to Spanish trade goods and a Spanish acknowledgement of Comanche territorial authority that had been functionally established for decades but had never been formally recognized. He was not making peace from weakness. He was formalizing a relationship the Numunuu had shaped on their own terms since those early councils in the first decade of the century. The words spoken in those first encounters, the reports the warriors brought back to camp, the debates in council over what the Spanish were and how to respond to them, those are gone from the written record. They were spoken in a language the Spanish rarely recorded accurately, even when they had interpreters present, in camps that no Spanish observer attended, about matters the Comanche had every reason to keep private. The silences in the archive are not accidents. They are a product of who maintained records and who did not, whose version of events survived in written form and whose was carried in memory and voice across generations without ever being committed to paper. What survives in those gaps is the consequence of decisions made in them. The Comanche looked at the Spanish, understood what they were looking at, and decided how to proceed. They did this with the deliberateness of people who recognized that the decisions mattered and who had the political culture to act on them with some consistency across the different bands and their different leaders. No single Comanche authority directed the response to Spanish expansion, but the patterns of behavior across those decades, the strategic raiding, the selective trading, the sustained pressure on Apache groups the Spanish relied upon, the careful management of information about Comanche numbers and locations, reflect something more than uncoordinated opportunism. They reflect people who had studied the situation and reached conclusions about it. The colonial world the Spanish had built over 2 centuries had a long record of success. They had systems for conquest and systems for incorporation. They had missionaries with the commitment and endurance to walk thousands of miles across desert country. They had soldiers, lawyers, and the backing of the largest empire in the world. They found, on the southern plains in the 18th century, that none of it was sufficient against a people who had studied them carefully, identified their weaknesses, and built a response that took 100 years to fully play out. By the time the Spanish crown lost Mexico and the Mexican Republic inherited the northern frontier, the Comanche remained the dominant power on the southern plains. The Republic of Texas would learn the same lesson at considerable cost. Texas Rangers, organized specifically to fight the Comanche on their own terms, suffered repeated reverses in the first decade of the Republic's existence before they began developing tactics adapted to the specific challenge. The Council House fight of 1840 in San Antonio, an attempt by Texas officials to take Comanche peace delegates hostage as leverage, resulted in the deaths of over 30 Comanche leaders and triggered retaliatory raids that burned towns and ranches across the Texas coast. The assumption behind the Council House strategy, that Comanche leaders could be dealt with the way a colonial power deals with subordinate peoples, proved catastrophically wrong in the same way it had proved wrong for the Spanish a century earlier. The Comanche did not operate that way. They never had. The United States Army would spend 30 years and substantial resources discovering what Spanish colonial records had already documented, that the Comanche could not be defeated by superior firepower alone in open country. The eventual destruction of Comanche independence in the 1870s came through the systematic destruction of the buffalo herds, the elimination of the economic foundation that supported everything else. It was not a military victory in any traditional sense. It was the removal of the ground under a civilization's feet. But that is a harder story for another time. The story that begins in those first encounters of the early 1700s is not a story of defeat. It is the story of a clear-eyed assessment made under genuine uncertainty by people who faced something new and unfamiliar and responded not with panic or deference, but with observation, counsel, and decision. The warriors who came back to camp with news of men and metal and weapons that made thunder were not delivering a report of something they could not understand. They were delivering intelligence. The elders who heard them asked practical questions. The bands acted on the answers. The process by which those answers were developed is worth pausing on, because it says something about the Comanche that gets lost when their history is told as a story of warfare alone. The Numunuu decision-making about the Spanish was collective in a specific way. Band leaders did not issue commands that followers obeyed. They built consensus through argument, through demonstration, through the slow accumulation of agreement among people who had standing because they had earned it. A leader who wanted the bands to adopt a new approach to the Spanish, whether more aggressive raiding or more active trade, had to make the case in the way Comanche leadership always made the case. Through example, through persuasion, through the practical demonstration that his reading of the situation was better than the alternatives. This was a slower process than the Spanish model of command and obedience. It was also more resilient. It could absorb the loss of any individual leader without losing its direction, because the direction came from the collective judgment of the people, not from the authority of one man. Whatever the specific words, the record of those actions speaks clearly enough. The Numunuu looked at the Spanish and concluded that these men could be dealt with, that their horses could be acquired, their trade goods obtained, their military weakness exploited, their settlements pressured, and their formal authority on the southern plains challenged and, ultimately, refused. The Spanish called them Comanche, a word borrowed from the Ute that carries the meaning, roughly, of someone who wants to fight you all the time. The people called themselves Numunuu, the same name any people gives itself when it wants to say simply, "We are the ones who matter here." On the southern plains across the 18th century, that claim was not arrogance. It was an accurate description of the political reality the Numunuu had built, starting from those early moments of observation and assessment, when warriors returned from the south and described what they had seen, and the camps listened and decided what to do next. The record cannot give us every word of what was said in those councils. What it gives us is what the Comanche decided, and what they built from those decisions over a century of sustained, deliberate, and largely successful engagement with the most powerful colonial empire in the Western Hemisphere. There is a broader truth here that the study of early American history does not always emphasize. The frontier, as Americans have tended to imagine it, was a line moving west, a boundary between the known and the unknown, between civilization and wilderness, between what had been incorporated and what had not yet yielded. The Comanche experience suggests that this image was always a fiction. The southern plains were not a wilderness. They were a managed domain, managed by the Numunuu with the same combination of knowledge, strategy, and force that any sovereign people uses to hold what it claims. The Spanish frontier line did not move west across empty country. It stopped against something. It stopped against people who had looked at it and decided, deliberately, that it would stop there. That is the answer to the question the title asks. Not the words, which are lost. The answer, which is written into the history of the Southern Plains in every decade from 1706 to 1875, and which says, plainly enough, "We looked at you. We understood what you were, and we were not afraid." Remember the names. Equericapa, the Numunuu, the people who looked at the Spanish Empire and decided it was manageable. They were right for a very long time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.